loving the days gone by Chapter 2, Night of Stars Descent Beatrice. And so, Betty and Bubby, along with the foolhardy human, reached the end of the journey which lasted shorter than 10 days and arrived at the crux, in fact. Lose. It certainly is a tremendous adventure. Despite only having unwillingly grumbled in the beginning, once she gained the momentum of reciting, words escaped her as though brimming over. Stirring the hot pot with a spoon whilst listening to this, Luz intermittently revealed the nail-biting tension she felt via facial expressions and utterances. A truly excellent listener. Thanks to this, Beatrice unwittingly indulged herself in reminiscing as well. Anyhow, the story now arrived at the critical dragon extermination, but, stranger, now that is a really interesting tale. What happens next? Beatrice. Yuck, I suppose. Before she could resume narrating, Beatrice grimaced upon hearing an unpleasant voice. Though the voice came from behind, she need not turn back, for he came around to her beforehand. Stranger. Yuck doesn't make for a greeting, does it? Won't you allow me to join in on your story? Interposing so and inclining his body, the individual somewhere between a youngster and a man, his navy blue hair stretching long, clad in dodgy devilishness, was peering at Beatrice's visage. His entrance had Luz's smile in Beatrice's stead. Luz. Roswal-sama, are you finished with your business? Roswal. Yes, it all went quite smoothly. It helps that the people here are all so cooperative, by their aid. It's ought to have made for another step closer toward the realization of teacher's dearest wish. Luz. I am elated to hear so, Beatrice-sama. You mustn't hang your head low. Eyes clear blue, the grinning youth, Roswal's entrance impelled Beatrice to scowl further, subsequently giving up on keeping her gaze cast downward for how futile it held. Beatrice. Got it, I suppose. Defeat accepted, in fact, from where had you been eavesdropping, I suppose. So distasteful, in fact. Roswal, eavesdropping, that's a nasty way to put it. To begin with, it had been decided that we would be having dinner here. If you're to start reminiscing in a place like this, then it's only a matter of course it'd enter my ears. Beatrice failed to pronounce even an as Roswal shrugged. Not pertaining exclusively to the time within sanctuary, meals were to be had with everyone as much as possible. That was a precept established by the witch Echidna, a decree neither Beatrice nor Luz, nor even Roswal could flout. Although just about the only one to feel tormented by this precept was Beatrice, being opposed to having to give company to Roswal. Luz. Roswal-sama, would you also happen to harbor any interest in Beatrice-sama's prior life? Roswal. Of course. It's a shame Beatrice doesn't talk much about her past. Since we're often compared, I had heard about the presence of her so-called older brother, but… Beatrice. You aren't something worth even a comparison with Bubby, I suppose. Don't be conceited, in fact. Roswal. Welp, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Taking a path around the hot pot atop flames, Roswal then boldly seated himself immediately beside Beatrice. Even when Beatrice shifted away, he consistently got that much closer and covered the distance in between. The man possessed no other intent but to wholeheartedly make Beatrice boundlessly groan. Roswal. It's a chance to get closer to the enigmas of your Bubby. It also makes me really curious how your first adventure concluded, Beatrice. Luz. I am also incredibly curious about that. Will Tosca-sama be able to protect his childhood friend? Finding an ally in the naive Luz, Roswal's odious pupils gawped at Beatrice. Of course, she did not have the option to not tell the rest after having come this far, but if that were to mean delighting Roswal, it was simply human nature for her to fail recounting enjoyably. Beatrice. Betty is an exalted spirit, so human nature isn't the correct term, I suppose. Roswal. There's no need to fuss over such minute semantics. Now then, considering how I'm not even worth comparing to him, what feats will your splendid Bubby make, I wonder? Beatrice. Do you hold something against Bubby, in fact? So pig-headed, I suppose. Beatrice furrowed her brows in dubiousness, his speech coming off as strangely thorny in essence. But Roswal provided no answer, as Luz smiled bitterly, expression convoluted. Beatrice. It feels vaguely uncanny, but moving on, in fact. After approximately 10 days, Betty and the others arrived at Karnatsi a day prior to the night of the full moon. Luz. Then Beatrice-sama and the villagers worked together, and the dragon extermination. Beatrice, did not come to be, in fact. A thought dearth in appropriate vigilance toward the circumstance truly befitting of Luz, but the reality did not unfold in identical vein. With the gazes of the two listeners in mind, Beatrice returned to that night once again. Beatrice, the reason why he came to Betty and everyone's place was because he had no allies in the village, I suppose. Tosca, why won't everyone try to stand up? An enraged bellow, in company of a mighty kick to the floor by Tosca. Having assessed him as the owner of a fairly composed personality for his age by dint of their meeting and journey, Beatrice was substantially astonished upon witnessing Tosca's exasperated form. However, what astonished her furthermore were the reactions of the dwellers of Carnetsea, who welcomed Tosca. A night preceding the promised night of full moon with the Blight Dragon, Tosca had returned home bringing help from the palace of the witch. It would be appreciable should they be delighted about not having to sacrifice a young girl from the village. In that case, despite feeling piqued by having to depend upon others, their purpose would have surely been fulfilled. However, the responses they attained in reality ran counter to any such conjectures and expectations. Stranger, what a foolish thing you've done, Tosca. Went to the Witch of Wisdom's place and brought back the daughter of the witch from there. How will we ever be able to pay any such recompense? A white-haired grandsire, the village headman mithered so with trembling vocals whilst solitarily facing Tosca in his home. Hearing this, the redness of Tosca's visage incremented further. Tosca, I don't mean to have everyone from the village shoulder the debt I've incurred. I arbitrarily went to the witch Sama's place. That's why I'll pay for the recompense. Headman, that's only natural. Your actions were self-indulgent. However, it would have been better had that made for borrowing the witch's might. His words befogged midway through, the village headman's cynic eye darted towards Beatrice and Puck. His glance was unpleasant, but not to an unanticipated degree. Beatrice had simply an unamused expression. However, it was Tosca who could not pardon this discourteous gaze. Tosca, I implored Beatrice Sama and Puck Sama to come with me. Please do not direct a gaze of this kind towards them. I will work together with the two of them and... Headman, rescue Ramina, you proclaim. Will you be able to oppose that fearsome blight dragon? Headman, foolish, truly foolish, Tosca. Why did you leave the village? Had you remained in the village, you could have spent identical time with Ramina, albeit for a scant 10 days. Articulating with pity, the village headman's eyes turned to outside of the building. Beyond the window, visible far away, was something akin to a shrine, the wooden door comprising its entrance tightly fastened. Headman, Ramina is inside of the shrine. Preparing for tomorrow, she has commenced her ritual for purification. You shan't even be allowed to meet her. Tosca, Ramina, Headman. Oh, Tosca, why must you have departed from the village? Should you have remained here, you would have made time and memories with Ramina. The same way as you, Ramina regarded you with fondness. Whether he set to chide him or was simply hopelessly inconsiderate, anyhow, the village headman's remarks violated Tosca's fury, which mustn't be disturbed. Tosca glared at the village headman, canines bared. Tosca, Ramina, the one Ramina loves is not me but Big Brother. As Ramina's dad, shouldn't you be the one who knows that the most? Relinquishing this assertion behind, Tosca stormed out of the village headman's home. His tail jolted by the vigor of the fierce gale birthed by Tosca, Puck exchanged a look with Beatrice. Beatrice drew her jaw in before Puck glided through the air and pursued the vanishing figure. And with Tosca and Puck's departure, the only ones left behind were Beatrice and the village headman. Beatrice. Betty, too, finds that to be quite witless, in fact. But his judgment to depend on the Witch of Wisdom was correct, I suppose. Betty is none other than the proxy of the witch, in fact. Headman. However, the pivotal witch Sama remains in absentia. Is this not what epitomizes being deserted by fortune? Beatrice, right when you have a chance, do you intend to forego the life of your own daughter, I suppose? Headman. In exchange for the village. Glowering at Beatrice, the village headman nailed his fist to the floor, giving rise to a report. The rage and awareness dwelling in his gaze were proof of having compared the scales of his own daughter and the village, and having deliberated earnestly. Henceforth, he had simply chosen his position as the chief of the village over his position as a father. Headman, Tosca was rash in his demands. By all means, please return. Beatrice, blight dragons, dragons use mountains as dwellings. That remains unchanged. Let it be labeled a blight dragon or not. It will settle on the mountain visible in the south of the village, I suppose. The sacrifices won't end with one, in fact. Beatrice, as uncouth as the name suggests, I suppose. Dusting away the hem of her dress, Beatrice chose to excuse herself from the village headman as well. By the very end, as Beatrice was on the brink of exiting, she heard the village headman murmur, "Remina." Yet Beatrice did not halt her steps. However, from her exchange with the village headman and the villagers who shied from showing themselves, she could tell. Beatrice, not everyone seems to have the mettle to battle the blight dragon, I suppose. By the point of Tosca's arrival at the palace of the witch all by himself, she had foreseen this to a certain extent. Primarily, tackling the palace of the witch was standardly done after forming a clique. Setting about with a group of more than 10, yet the ones to reach the palace were a scant 1 or 2, that was the class of trial it was. Yet, Tosca fulfilled it by himself. That did not allude to the aspect of his exiguous mobile ability and power of will alone, but also portended the negative of isolation. Tosca had no allies. Nobody was seeking to settle matters with the blight dragon. Tosca, I apologize for showing such a pathetic sight to you. Beatrice was being guided to the rear of the shrine, having departed from the village headman's home and followed Puck's responses. There, Tosca bowed and apologized, leaning on the fences enclosing the village. Levitating beside him, Puck hugged his tail with a hum. Puck, was it pathetic? I feel like you're the only one not being pathetic in this village, though. Beatrice, Betty agrees, I suppose. For a human, you're on the better side, in fact. Tosca, ha, that way of putting it would be a bit. Receiving Puck and Beatrice's comfort, a smile recrudesced onto Tosca's expression. Of course, a mere bravado, but being cheered up meant being cheered up. Before it dwindled away, they must have the conversation they inevitably ought to. Beatrice, it doesn't seem like there can be any allies found in this village who will assist you in battle, I suppose. Puck, yeah, there's little hope. Seems everyone is so scared of the blight dragon that they've shut themselves in. The village was a small and confined one. All within the village must have hearkened Tosca's voice when he roared inside the village headman's home. Yet nobody attempted to come forth. And Remina, isolated within the shrine calling the ritual for purification upon herself, was no exception. Puck, won't you call out to her? Tosca, after having yelled the pinnacle of patheticness just now. Gazing at the shrine, Tosca responded to Puck, who tilted his neck. His pessimism was only natural, considering Tosca's remarks shortly earlier. For the childhood friend he wished to rescue, Remina, the one she loved was not him but his elder brother. Though judging solely from the hearsay they had learned here and there through the course of their journey, he seemed to be quite the unprecedented sort of personage. Tosca, had Big Brother been over here, we wouldn't have had to worry about Remina becoming a sacrifice for the dragon. I'm sure neither the village headman nor the folks of the village would have been afraid of the dragon. Tosca, but the one over here is me. She thought he would yet again itemize words lamenting his own powerlessness, gaze cast down. However, before the silent Beatrice and Puck, Tosca marked brief words comprising the impetus to look forward by his own volition. Tosca bit his lips, clenched his fists, and mightily, powerfully, gripped the handle of the sword on his hip. Tosca, so what if it's a blight dragon? As if I'm ever going to hand Remina over to just a big lizard like that. Fighting with the dragon is way better than Big Brother's knuckles. Beatrice, that comparison is just weird, in fact. Puck, but gotta say, he's got quite the boyish expression right there. Whether promising or pathetic, Beatrice slumped her shoulders seeing the way Tosca resolved his determination. Yet Puck seemed to hold a different view, somehow appearing thrilled. Beatrice, well, this is better for Betty than having to lend her strength to a coward, I suppose. She did not spend 9 days and came all the way here in order to watch humans dispute. It was for the havoc enkindled by a dragon, its breakthrough, and to prove the hand of salvation of the Witch of Wisdom sought by humans across the world, its definite might and promise. Beatrice, Betty and Bubby don't have the option to withdraw to begin with. in fact. You will be held accountable for the responsibility of having brought us outside of that palace, I suppose. Tosca, you're truly unsparing, Beatrice Jan. Beatrica, you, MGH. When she attempted to rebuke him that this was no time to interrupt, Tosca's mien intercepted her. An earnest gaze and expression were a show of resolution. If referring to Beatrice so casually coincided with that in exchange, then she could overlook it at least this one time. Beatrice. However, you won't be getting a second chance, in fact. Tosca, I am aware. It seems we must work out a plan. Had we gotten more allies from the village, we could have charged into the Blight Dragon head-on, but… Puck, you had such a thick-headed strategy. I'd say it's a bit reckless against a dragon. Even Puck was slightly astounded by a policy so erratic and haphazard. Same went for Beatrice, but now was the point in utmost need of wisdom in this time's situation. Per Puck's statement, challenging a dragon head-on destitute of other measures was akin to suicide rather than simply being a poor plan. As a matter of course, an ambush was necessary. Beatrice, tomorrow night, what's the arrangement for presenting the sacrifice going to be like, I suppose? Tosca, halfway up the mountain in the south, Remina will be taken there and to the Blight Dragon Puck. She will get proffered. Betty, think of anything. Beatrice visualized the program for presenting the sacrifice within her mind, a hand positioned onto her chin. Taking a minute to ponder, the conclusion Beatrice subsequently reached was, Beatrice, from your childhood friend's house, bring clothes deeply fragmented with her scent, in fact. Upon Beatrice's instruction betraying expectations, Tosca responded as though having forgotten his resentment and restlessness. Tosca, once this ends, would you look at me a bit more instead of Big Brother? Before commencing action, Tosca did not have any exchange with his childhood friend. Simply leaning on the shrine's wall, he unilaterally cast a wish. No answer came to it, and even if it did, Tosca surely did not wish for it to enter his ears. Thus, this was solely a rite necessary for the final push of his resolution. Beatrice and Puck spoke not, deeming that pointing this out would be boorish as well. And the three mobilized action a night before the full moon, in other words, the very same day. Beatrice, this mountain is a small, shabby, remote one, I suppose. Doesn't seem to be much of a sacred ground either. It's a mystery why a dragon powerful in itself is still making this a part of its turf, in fact. Puck, might be that there's a serious shortage of mountains. From what I heard, there's also dragons who abandoned mountains for dwellings and are staying in castles after driving humans out of them. It's just hijacking at this point. Beatrice, what a savage thing to do, I suppose. They are just lizards with wings after all, in fact. Puck, whoa, go off, Betty. Puck voiced a restrained chuckle, the tip of his tail at his mouth. Tickling Puck's scruff, Beatrice moved her body and shifted her hips. Parts of her body stiffened if she were to remain in the same position for long. Beatrice had been crafted by her mother, a witch, but such encumbrances of her body were no different from humans. Neither could she unfasten her body and slip into the mana in the air at will like Puck. The only reorganization permitted to Beatrice was solely the dress and hair comprising her guise. Tosca, I say this again, but you two seem to get along really well. Tosca murmured, somewhat nervously, watching the two siblings frolic from clothes. Even during the journey, Beatrice and Puck's laughs and teasing did not peter out. Had he been an impatient youngster, he must have indisputably detonated on some point midway through. Or perhaps Tosca was able to withstand such circumstances due to personal experience. Beatrice, just as you can see, I suppose. And it looked like a lot of stuff happened with your real brother on your end. In fact, Tosca, not at all. It's just that Big Brother is someone who attracts people's gazes, and I always stood stuck behind him. It's because of that I wasn't able to even get into the sight of the girl I like, that's all. Puck, smells like bittersweet youth. Tosca, youth? I get what you mean by bittersweet, though. I wonder if I'm yet immature. Tosca's query as he scratched his cheek made it difficult for Beatrice to answer with a so immature. She was aware of being incomparably more profoundly and richly abound in terms of knowledge than Tosca. But in outline, Tosca stood above Beatrice in terms of true age and years of experience. Besides, She recalled problems in the sphere of love and affection having troubled and distressed even her mother. Beatrice, Betty will anyhow say nothing regarding the relation between you and the childhood friend. Betty also loves Bubby, but it appears it's different from that. Tosca, when you say the two of you are siblings, Puck, when made by the same person using the same technique, I'd say it counts as siblings by that point. Though me staying in that palace with Betty is like a period of preparation before I live independently. Beatrice, live independently. Puck's indifferent say plunged Beatrice into solitude. One day, Puck will depart from that palace and leave to search for something solely his own. She had heard about that before, and as long as it was concerned with Puck's mission, Beatrice couldn't impede either. For the crafted lives that were artificial spirits, the meaning for being born was the weightiest, most exalted and valuable of all. Tosca, the meaning for being born, is it? Beatrice, you all are different from Betty and Bubby, I suppose. For how short-lived you are, search for it with the utmost of all your might, in fact. Tonight, Betty will make time for that, I suppose. Not for a conferred mission, but they must determine the path to walk on, to live on by oneself. It could be that the path remained beyond discovery, and they very much lost their way. Beatrice regarded them, who walked such thorned paths, such unilluminated nights, with commiseration. It was for this reason that the doors of the palace of the Witch of Wisdom reigned open to those harboring any wishes. Tosca, Beatrice Sama, Beatrice, HMP, still too early for gratitude, in fact. Even if you've been overwhelmed with emotion, save it for after everything's been cleaned up, I suppose. Tosca, no, that. Your elbow's touching me and it hurts. Would you mind shifting aside a bit? Beatrice, you really have a serious lack of respect for Betty, in fact. Beatrice yelled, just when she thought what it was that he was about to say with such a meek tone. Tosca expressed a wry smile to her angry remark, but the distance between her and his face was bizarrely close. That was a matter of course, at present. Beatrice and Tosca, along with Puck, were so to speak glued together. They had all gotten inside a single laundry basket, their breaths concealed, were in the midst of concealing, fundamentally. Utilizing the laundry basket which the sacrifice had been in as camouflage, they shall ambush thereon. That was the entirety of the Blight Dragon extermination operation. Puck, it's simple, but there's no need to make things complex. Betty and I don't have sense like ordinary creatures, so it won't come off as odd even if we're with Tosca. Tosca, when I was told to go steal Ramina's clothes, and when I was glutted with cold water, I was beginning to doubt what all you were making me do, but makes sense. Beatrice, erasing your personal scent and overriding it with the childhood friend's scent instead, I suppose. Women's scents are acute. The dragon will surely get beguiled too, in fact. All they had to do was to await until eventually it negligently drew near in order to ascertain the laundry basket's content. Should they win the minimum of its unpreparedness and opportunity, the rest would then be Beatrice and Puck's stage. Should it come close enough to enter a sword's range, then Tosca's sword strikes would also attain a window. Sooner or later, Tosca. I hold no objections but the way you phrased that. Puck, now Betty is thinking in Tosca's best interest. That being said, getting into a laundry basket and awaiting a dragon, not a monster. I feel like there was some folktale like this. Tosca, folktale. Of what kind would that be? Inside of the tightly packed laundry basket, as though averting his eyes from the amplifying insecurity and nervousness, Tosca bit at the chit-chat Puck proposed. Puck, it's pretty similar to our current situation. An evil monster settled beside a certain village and made a ruckus demanding a sacrifice to be offered. And so, it welcomed not only the sacrifice but also booze and stuff, and when the monster completely fell asleep like a baby, they perfectly sliced off its head. Tosca, it would be great if it all were to go so smoothly. The circumstances certainly resembled each other significantly, but the fashion in which Puck narrated it insinuated it to be a fable for children. The wryly smiling Tosca seemed to have reckoned the same. On the other hand, Beatrice wielded a separate impression. Beatrice, Betty does not know of that story, I suppose. Bubby is so well informed, in fact. Puck, it's just a matter of chance, a matter of chance. I don't really remember where I heard it from that well either. But isn't it a bit reassuring to think there's been predecessors? If someone had succeeded in monster extermination in an analogous situation, then their plan will surely go well too. Such optimistic views of Puck certainly heartened Beatrice and Tosca. Thereon their dialogue diminished as they awaited that moment to pay a call. It was a night prior to the originally promised one. They possessed no proof the dragon would come to inspect this laundry basket. However, if this mountain had become the dragon's turf, then it would come to ascertain the foreign object set by its footstep. For that was the attribute of the creatures who placed the world under their reign, called as dragons. Whilst awaiting the dragon's visit, Beatrice incidentally thought that should this first task of hers be wrapped up safely, would her mother even commend her. Puck, if you lend this much of a hand, then it will have gone slightly astray from her policy of self-help endeavors, after all. As though having read through Beatrice's heart, Puck's pinpointing stung sharp to her chest. The witch Echidna who granted wisdom, her policy fundamentally, was to present a solution before those who reached the palace, and for them to apply it as the problem's resolution by themselves. In a majority of cases, humans sought immediate solutions to problems. However, focusing entirely on reliance, they did not wish for growth, and lost sight of means to rescue their own self was her mother's idea. Beatrice endorsed this idea, very much so, and believed normally resolutions must be won by the diligent endeavors of the party concerned. But Beatrice, this time is an exception, a special case, I suppose. There won't be a second time, in fact. Puck, hope so, Betty, Tosca. Followed by a short laugh, Puck's faintly lowered voice called Beatrice and Tosca. The instant they received it, Beatrice and Tosca's nervousness elevated to its topmost, and simultaneously, its arrival was sensed by their instinct before any of the five senses. Since time immemorial, it descended from the skies high above, flapping those potent wings, the monarch of aerial creatures that monopolized the sky. The being fated to be a ruler by birth, its valiant advent. An absolute being that hustled aside every other, whose presence alone jolted the atmosphere. Conjecturing it was immediately close through its pressure, and the tremor caused by its stepping foot onto the ground, Beatrice halted her breath. Had Beatrice possessed a beating heart, it must have undoubtedly simmered vehemently like a hot pot verging on exploding upon sensing this existence up close. Through their journey, they had purported them as mere lizards with wings and fools who wallowed in their own strength. And though these had been their genuine beliefs, they were also simultaneously a bluff and part of their unwillingness to admit defeat. They needed to coax themselves into believing dragons were trifling beings, because they knew if they did not do so they would be rendered immobile when meeting the real one. Inside the same laundry basket, Beatrice could hear Tosca's heartbeat. Tosca, cheeks stiff, perspired sweat through his whole body without pause. Status akin to all biological responses of the body, except for the heart having simultaneously come to a halt. Prior to dying, the body had commenced conscious preparation for death. She could understand that feeling painfully well. She need not know what the ache of which part would be like. Puck. Betty. In the midst of such delirious entanglement of consciousness, a tender voice connected with Beatrice's earlobe. A quick glance to the side, there present was Puck nestling by her cheekbone. Her tender brother, his black eyes narrowed, inquired Beatrice. Puck, do I do it? The question was one she had been asked countless times throughout this journey. And on every instance of this question, Beatrice presumed upon Puck's heart. Beatrice. Thank you, I suppose, Bubby. She mustn't presume upon Puck anymore. This was something Beatrice had started, and something Beatrice must fulfill. For this was a trial incumbent to accomplish the mission Beatrice had been born with. And Beatrice. Minya. Accepting the push of resolve, Beatrice chanted. The polished mana meddled with the world, the alteration thus born instantaneously derived results. Light was emitted out the laundry basket and laid a direct hit onto the opponent. Tosca. Hick! She felt Tosca gulp a breath, right beside. However, she had not the time to be mindful of his astonishment. She solely bid to decimate the opponent with her all. Beatrice. Minya, 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 Minya. Materialized with each shout were lethal stakes shimmering in purple brought forth by yin magic, Minya. Manifest as purple crystals, They were a category of forbidden curses that froze the target's time, attenuating their existence itself and shattering them, an attack before whom no flesh body, no matter how robust or able, held any significance. Dragons' scales, which not even steel could scathe, were no exception, the only options to counter being either to dodge or to be clad in mana firm enough to withstand any intervention of magic. However, negligence lost the dragon of both said options. Beatrice, Minya. Puck, Betty, calm down. Beatrice, Minya. Puck, Betty. Beatrice cannonaded magic with undivided attention before Puck clung to her face. Her awareness robbed by the soft sensation, Beatrice returned to composure. She had been attacking toward the gargantuan silhouette before her eyes, entirely absorbed. A disgrace. Should the opponent rebrace its stance and counterattack, her eyes would fail to even spot it. However, Beatrice's such anxieties were nothing more than needless. Puck. It's over, Betty. The dragon isn't moving anymore. Beatrice. Once Puck moved aside from Beatrice's face, her breaths hoarse, her field of vision opened. A beat later, the sound akin to thirsted frosting entered Beatrice's ears as well. And what was reflected in her now opened gaze was the majestic stature of the dragon looking down upon the laundry basket, its height enough to direct gazes upward, at a distance of about 10 meters close. Closely packed scales shrouding its whole body, enormous wings that pirouetted its gargantuan build in the air. Its claws and fangs so fiendishly sharp they could tear into an iron armor like candy, befitting of a species counted as standalone cataclysms. However, never again would anyone be tormented by this cataclysm, for the dragon's frame had sustained the stillness of time, having transmuted into purple crystals. Tosca. This, easily. Puck. This is how fights where one side is lying in wait fully prepared go, striking with the greatest possible strength and crushing the enemy in one go. Betty's plan was the correct answer by far. Sermoning the dumbfounded Tosca, Puck gently levitated away from the partly destroyed laundry basket. Going further upward, Puck positioned himself still before the now crystallized dragon, and gently caressed the dragon's muzzle with the tip of his stretched tail. The following moment, crevices formed from the point he caressed, and the entire frame of the blight dragon shattered and dissipated. Only glistening fragments remained, for the end of a blight dragon who tormented many, an exceedingly short demise and no other way to describe it. Puck, flawless performance, Betty. Tosca, too, thank you for your hard work. Tosca, I've done nothing, truly, absolutely nothing, so. Both Beatrice and Tosca identically felt how anticlimactic this was. Of course, it was not as though they wished to play a fierce skirmish with the blight dragon. The primary factor jeopardizing the village now gone, they had attained a perfect victory with not as much as a scratch. The results were in fact to an unforeseen extent. Henceforth, they had not been particularly pitched into a state of ecstasy either. Tosca, I've truly done no. Beatrice, without losing heart, you sought salvation from Mother. It can be said however many times, but that is your achievement in fact. Tosca, Beatrice Sama, insisted Beatrice to Tosca, who failed to escape his astonishment. Beatrice's mind, too, was steadily, gradually reorganized, giving rise to comprehension. That they had safely succeeded in subjugating the blight dragon and fulfilled Tosca's purpose, Beatrice's mission. For the first time ever since she was born, she exited the palace, embarked on a journey, and killed a living being. That her first kill was a blight dragon was quite the gallant record she had etched in her own history. Beatrice, a weak human depending on wisdom and connection to defeat a strong enemy, is not a bad thing, I suppose. However, it's no good to become completely reliant, in fact. Don't get carried away, and think you'll have another chance hereon, I suppose. To have this presumed upon and be depended upon each time something occurred would run counter to her mother's policy. Neither did Beatrice wish to save a human of such nature, either. Thus, Tosca, I understand, but thank you very much. Thanks to the two of you, the village, Ramina, was saved. Thus, Beatrice deemed Tosca's disposition, this being his answer, to be on the good side for a human. His smile was yet powerless, and needed to digest a lot, which she could sympathize with. Even so, Tosca nonetheless looked forward. Beatrice, Well, say your thanks not to Betty but to the proprietor of the palace, Mother, in fact. To the utmost, Betty is only a proxy for Mother, I suppose. Puck, you can never be honest who Betty. Anyhow, it was pretty unexpected. I had braced myself thinking it'd be a bigger, more powerful dragon. Looking down onto the shattered fragments of the dragon, Puck swayed his tail by the point its shattered cranium had been. Upon Puck's words, Beatrice glanced a quick view of the fragments and furrowed her brows. Exactly as Puck's words, it all felt a bit too fast regardless of the ambush's success. The dragon was an individual too, so it was possible this one was a special foe, but Beatrice. Could it be? Yes, the foreboding that urged Beatrice's mind was synchronous with the situation's alteration. Tosca. Ah! Eyes dilated, frozen motionless, Tosca stepped back whilst looking up to the sky. Following the course of his gape, Beatrice and Puck also comprehended what made him harbor this terror. Ahead was a silhouette calmly airborne in the night sky soaring toward them. Beatrice. It all did seem a bit too easy, in fact. Beatrice reaffirmed. Had she possessed a heart, it must have been pounding with vehemence once again. A small dragon under its command, the blight dragon who truly placed Mount Carnatsy under its reign, a dragon boasting scales of silver. That was what slowly descended before the immobilized three. Taking gigantic laps around Mount Carnatsy, what steadily descended to take foot before them was a dragon of silver. Prior to the beauty of its scales or remarkable pupils, adorned with erudite intellect, came its gargantuan size. If the dragon they had defeated was 10 meters in length, then the one before them now was easily more than thrice its size. Dragons 30 meters huge could only be seen on notably sacred mountains. However, the silver dragon was enshrined before Beatrice and the group's eyes as a being of reality. Tosca. Whoa, ah! A groan escaped Tosca's throat, engulfed into the dragon's majestic dignity and the glint in its eye. He was not the slightest of a coward. Bearing in mind the heroism and valor he had tackled the palace of a nebulous witch for the sake of his childhood friend with, he could forthright be labeled a prominent hero, even amongst all of humanity. For the same Tosca, the silver dragon bore overwhelming spirit that mutilated sanity. And sustaining pressure identical to Tosca, Beatrice attained a certain realization. Judging from Tosca's reaction, the dragon before their eyes was none other than the true blight dragon that demanded sacrifice from the village. However, never did Tosca inform them that there were a plurality of dragons. Look to him at the side, and it could be understood with ease that he did not know that either. Multiple dragons, that too of this colossal size, had established a mountain so tiny as their base. The circumstances veiled on the flip side, their answer was evident. Beatrice, you all had destroying the village as your purpose from the very beginning, I suppose. Stranger, thou killed mine brethren, didn't thee, O bobbling ones? The deep, grousing voice of the dragon descended upon them, as though ridiculing Beatrice's mutters. Having lived through umpteen years, the dragon in acquisition of intellect could comprehend human speech. To go back on that, the origin of which amongst humans, spirits or dragons first began talking in words would also be something of immense interest. That was how overwhelmingly daunting the silver dragon was, impelling one to rend their thoughts with such escapism. Stranger, thou killed mine brethren, didn't thee, O bobbling ones? Beatrice, you're audible loud and clear, no need to repeat yourself, in fact. Your purpose is to stranger, then we hast only one behest, to exact retribution upon the fallen scales of mine brethren. The silver dragon's voice, abounding in dignity, was chaperoned by profoundness rather than conceiving might. Feeling as not the wind after drenching downpours, but the sensation of plummeting toward a bottomless seabed. Coincidentally, Beatrice realized they had granted it a pretext. The dragon they had initially ambushed had been the opponent's trap itself. Beatrice had given the dragon a reason to take revenge. Amongst dragons existed rare cases who had formed pacts with humans, probing for a path of coexistence. However, should retribution be hailed as a just cause, then even they would make no attempt to readily mediate. She shall straightforwardly admit they got trapped inside a scrupulous scheme. However, she bore a doubt. Beatrice, why do you go so far to target this village, I suppose? Judging by a glance, it's just a remote village with nothing special, in fact. A sacred mountain of no sizable worth, and a village too small to scramble for. Blight dragons who simply enjoyed persecuting the weak were not few. But the silver dragon before their eyes demarcated a line from paltry dragons like those. Upon Beatrice's question, the silver dragon aimed its crystalline golden pupils upon Tosca. Stranger, it is patent. Destroy that redhead's lineage. Tosca, me. Abruptly elevated onto the stage, Tosca was acutely bewildered. The silver dragon's leer directly lanced Tosca. That dragon would not jest. Hence, if so, then the silver dragon's aim lay neither in the village nor in the sacrifice, but in Tosca. Puck. Lineage, so precisely Tosca's kin, I'm guessing. I don't really get what it means, though. The silver dragon's glare focused on him. Tosca's breathing plunged into disarray, devoid of any such idea. Puck descended to his shoulder and caressed his cheek in an attempt to calm him, whilst beside them Beatrice embraced identical dubiety. What was there that could grant significance to its aim being Tosca's family? Stranger. The other day, Amangam of the East hath fallen and wares of silver dragons splintered in every direction. We too art a ware splintered hence, upon losing our pillar. Beatrice, Amangam, the one who controls eastern lands, head of silver dragons, it fell, I suppose. Stranger. Precisely. Beatrice was staggered by the words the silver dragon communicated. Dragons formed wares throughout the world on all kinds of lands, but they had factions therein, and any representative ones that spearheaded them were famous across the world. The Amangam who controlled the East, which the silver dragon had spoken of, was one who spearheaded one such ware. And if the downfall of the head of silver dragons was the genesis of Tosca's family being aimed after. Beatrice. Could it be, do you mean that this man's family is involved in the fall of the head of silver dragons, in fact? Stranger. Following the blood hath reached this land. Nay, that it was a contention of the blight dragon. No, the proud silver dragon meant this was a deed of conviction. And whilst Beatrice digested this truth, behind her, Tosca lost strength in his legs. Puck still atop his shoulder, Tosca kneeled, stupefied with his eyes fixed onto the ground. Tosca. It's Big Brother, he whispered, his tone one of despair. Puck. Big Brother, you mean that older brother of yours whom you frequently mentioned, Tosca? Catching his utterances, Puck inquired back, to which Tosca nodded. He then moved his lips, quaking in fear, and wrung out a voice pronouncing, "That's how it's always been." Tosca, always getting into trouble and being a nuisance, at last, just when I thought he arbitrarily left the village. This time he killed the leader of a group of dragons, and they've come to take revenge on me and the village WI. For what? The fierce elder brother whom Tosca had often brought up. It had seemed as though he had distorted a sense of inferiority in Tosca pertaining to his elder brother, enlarging his idolized image. But it appeared that the matter was not so simple. No, not so complex. Tosca did not doubt that his elder brother killed the head of dragons, which even the silver dragon before their eyes obeyed. And much to their dread, neither did the silver dragon repudiate Tosca's ideas. It was simple. Tosca's tellings until now had all been fact, and his elder brother was a monster exceeding norms. For it was that monster who felled the head of silver dragons, Beatrice. As retribution for the fall of their leader, the silver dragons targeted the culprit's family, truly straightforward and unheeding to appearances, I suppose. The name and reputation of the dragon clan will weep, in fact. Stranger, speak per thy liking as long as thou art unacquainted with that being. That being shalt fell all what is nowise human. O spirits, thou art nay exception either. Puck, it's enough to hold dragons in crisis. It's really no matter we can just laugh off as an exaggeration, you know. Beatrice and Puck. The dragon chimed a warning bell for the two who were spirits as well. Was that how tremendous the might of Tosca's elder brother was? Potency to which even dragons yielded, he may possibly qualify to count as an absolute personage ranking on par with the witches. The feeling of one's heart being daunted before far too inordinate an existence was something Beatrice could empathize with too. Beatrice. But, sad to say, if it is to kneel before someone identically inordinate, then that person has already been decided, I suppose. stranger, regrettable. Hearing Beatrice's caustic remark, the silver dragon honed the glint in its eye, surmising they wouldn't withdraw. Its golden eyes that conceived brimming intellect steadily transformed into ones enveloped in rage and bellicosity. Synchronously, the atmosphere quaked, the ground agitated, and rained the premonition of death upon the opposition. Swallowed by the pressure of this silver dragon, before the battle even commenced, Tosca became unable to Beatrice. Stand in fact, Tosca. However, Beatrice's voice powerfully smited the shrunken, unmoving Tosca. Tosca elevated his visage, looking at Beatrice with eyes startled. Beatrice had turned her eyes away from the fearsome silver dragon and was staring in Tosca's direction. The dragon's intimidation, piercing the side of her face, was dreadful, even inducing the hallucination of her entire body being whittled. But she gnashed her molars and withstood it, glaring at Tosca. Beatrice, voice your wish, I suppose, Tosca. Betty is mother's proxy, the daughter of the witch Echidna, who grants means to fulfill the frantic wishes of humans, in fact. Tosca. I am, Beatrice. Now it is time to fulfill your wish, I suppose. Beatrice held her hand out, pointing towards the silver dragon before their eyes. Beholding this, Tosca gnashed his molars with force. Light rebounded to his blue eyes, which had forfeited their strength, gripping to the handle of the sword by his hip. The youth stood up, his hair so red as to be set ablaze. Tosca. I am going to take Romina as my wife. I've loved her since long before. Beatrice. You, the wish, Og, even that works at this point, in fact. Tosca, I'll protect the village. Even if nobody fights alongside me, they split food with me when I felt hungry. They sheltered me when I cried after Big Brother hit me. I love everyone. Beatrice. More, I suppose. Tosca. As if I'm ever going to give up, because of some nuisance Big Brother brought with him. You bloody, damn, shitty little Big Brother. The next time you come back, I'll have you hold your nephews or nieces in your arms. Hollering, Tosca drew the sword from his hip. A tawdry, crudely made sword, nevertheless in these moments shimmered with the hero's spirit. As Tosca braced it straight ahead, by his side Beatrice and Puck exchanged a glance. The opponent was Silver Dragon, a Herculean individual 30 meters in size. Beatrice was a novice who had just experienced killing for the first time a couple of moments ago. A 3-person troupe with no coordination or anything. However, through these 9 days, they spent their days and nights together. Their bond, albeit transient and brittle, was definite. Consequently, Tosca. Come at us, lizard bastard. I'll turn you into a wedding dinner. Receiving this proclamation, the silver dragon lightly widened its eyes. And Fargal, I art one who shall avenge the head of silver dragons, Fargal. Fargal, though a misdirected retribution, I shall destroy adversaries of mine family by blood. Blood relative of the fallen head of silver dragons, the dragon. No, Fargal unfurled its wings. A violent current furiously blew. The shockwave cleaved the earth, swallowing the 3 within. But the pressure of that gale and tremor immediately vanished. Puck, didn't I tell you that I'm an ally to maidens in love and youthful youngsters? Ahead of Beatrice and Tosca, that which instantly expanded his presence. No, his mass and transfigured his body into one on par with the silver dragons, was Puck. Having transformed his adorable outward appearance into a ginormous beast, Puck commanded a view above even the silver dragon. Puck, it's just that I'm still practicing it, so I can't make it last for too long. Fargal, spirit. Beatrice, understandable, but you're going to regret it if you fall for Bubby. Thus blew a gale glaciating the world. Amidst the white that chilled even the dragon, Beatrice made her move as well. Purple arrows infinite were knocked in the environs, and the battle of the witch's proxy, the battle of the silver dragon subjugation, commenced. Fargal, Jayaaz. The battle began with a dragon breath, a misapprehension of the world being rocked intermingling within. She had entered the battle after quite the grandstanding, but Beatrice's combat ability was by no means great. Despite abounding in disposition and talent, her lack of experience in real battling shan't turn traitor to victory or defeat. In this battle against the silver dragon, Beatrice possessed not a single decisive blow up her sleeve. However, that did not make for Beatrice being luggage unable to battle. Beatrice, El Minura a hic. Lightening the weight of her body, Beatrice fusilladed a hail of purple arrows whilst dancing in the wind. Unlike the dragon taken out in the ambush, Fargal's scales were clad in powerful mana. They impetuously diminished the might of magic, a firm armor that shielded its body. Beatrice's bombardment thwarted by the armor, not even as slight as a single strike connected. However, Puck, the star-beastified Puck's enormous forelimbs placed a firm hit onto the silver dragon's trunk. The dragon, in a matter of moments, attempted to brace its legs, but the ground below its feet crystallized and shattered. Minya stopped time of not just living creatures. Inorganic substances could be its targets as well. Its brace proving to be fruitless, the silver dragon directly received Puck's robust arm. The gargantuan build, akin to an amalgamation of multiple gigantic trees, was thrown into the air as though weightless, and the blizzard toward that direction intensified. The rampaging wind clad itself in blades of frost and charged towards the silver dragon imprisoned therein. The might of the minor tempest was immense. Some offhand dragon would have gotten trapped within the instant it got touched, its body minced to a million shreds. However, the opponent was no offhand dragon. Its pedigree and existence as an individual were all of the highest order. Fargal Jayaz, smashing through the tempest via the current birthed upon unfurling its closed wings. The following moment, a heat ray varnished the world in silver. The heat wave released by the silver dragon approached Beatrice, killing even sound. No, Beatrice simply happened to be in its trajectory. However, it was sufficient to rob her life in the aftermath. Within that juncture, as Beatrice stood ready for death, Puck swooped in ahead and accepted the heat ray. A groan escaped the depths of his bulky throat before Beatrice instantly clung to the feet of her elder brother. Clinging to his long fur, she cheered her elder brother withstanding this agony with her all. Potentially that bore its fruits. Puck forcefully turned his frame and escaped the heat ray, looking back to Beatrice, who grasped his fur and then swung down his gigantic arm. Synchronized with the movement of his arm, multiple house-sized flows of ice drew towards the dragon. The silver dragon countered them. Some were repelled by the heat ray, others by the dragon's wings or dragon claws, and attempted to launch a pursuit towards Puck. However, Tosca, Oaaorg, flew out a bloody Tosca, having slipped into the smashed ice flows. Amidst the unheeding decisive battle of human and dragon, bearing innumerable wounds throughout his body, Tosca nonetheless did not allow for his fighting spirit to falter, and assailed the silver dragon head-on. A silver flash swung, a strike composed of all his might afflicted upon the dragon's bulky, burly neck, a strike of utterly perfect timing and sword technique. What was lacking was defense. Tosca. Hic! A shrill note resounded. By the point the edge of his sword was rammed into the dragon's neck, it fractured. Tosca's beloved sword that had supported the battle until now had been a single tread lacking in slashing the silver dragon's scales. As is, the silver dragon narrowed its eyes toward the midair Tosca, now rendered defenseless. The subsequently launched dragon claw was perhaps an attack lacquered with honor and respect toward the warrior. However, no matter what sentiment those claws were imbued with, it meant no change in the consequence they yielded. A singular claw was large enough to rip the body of a human. In but a blink, the existence named Tosca altered into a spray of blood Fargal. What? In the midst of battle, there existed not even the scope to spin words of significance. This applied to both the dragon and them, yet the dragon's unrest for the first time quaked the atmosphere. Fargal ought to have seized Tosca in the claw strike and brought his existence to complete ruin. However, Tosca, who ought to have perished, fluttered through the air via fearsome impact, not dead nevertheless. Beatrice, Murak! A hand upraised, Beatrice casted magic towards Tosca the second he was going to be attacked. Not a consequence foreplanned, but the optimum solution complying with the situation derived instinctively. When he was about ensnared in the claws, she made Tosca's body light like fluff, and the wind pressure and impact of the claws escaped him from any fatal wounds. The result, Tosca barely managed to cling to his life. Fargal. Regardless, despite eluding it once, the consequence named death was inexorable. In order to prove this, the glint in Fargal's eye arrested the airborne Tosca. Gaping its mouth wide open, the setup to fire a heat ray was completed in the span of a breath. The inferno that scorched the world's silver paid no heed to the weight of the target to be scorched to ruin. The tip of this ruin trivialized Tosca. It was on the brink of doing so when, stranger, Tosca, a clamorous voice, not belonging to anyone present here. The voice of someone Beatrice, Puck, and even Fargal were unbeknownst of. A voice that solely Tosca, hovering in the air, knew whom it belonged to. Remina. Tosca's lips moved so, as his blue pupils discerned the form of a slender young girl underneath trespassing onto Mount Karnatsy, now a battlefield. The girl grasped crude steel unbefitting her hands. Holding it aloft, with all her strength, she flung it in Tosca's direction. The whirling object was same as one that had fractured earlier, a tawdry sword. Fargal, however, I shan't allow it to reach. Puck, I wouldn't be so sure. I'm an ally to maidens in love, after all. The silver dragon set to deliver the finishing blow before the sword reached Tosca. Its oral cavity attempted to heave the heat ray, when an impact from below overbearingly shut it close and misdirected its aim. The silver inferno, lost of destination, exploded within its mouth, and the silver dragon greatly recoiled from the impact. His entire body scorched, smeared in wounds. It was Puck's attack. No, that was not an attack. He simply enlarged by the dragon's feet, a mere vigorless body collision. However, the hero plunged into the priceless interval it nonetheless bore. Tosca. Wo-wo-a-a-a-a-a-ah. Receiving the hurled katana, Tosca dropped towards the silver dragon's direction after having turned his body. Innumerable sword strikes struck the dragon's scales, repelled by their firmness, gouged them, repelled yet again. Repeating this cycle, he resumed to etch a gash. Its flesh and blood gouged, the dragon shrieked. A rigid sound reverberated, the katana snapped from the middle yet again. However, toward Tosca, who lost his sword, Tosca, the voice calling him was accompanied by a successively hailed rain of identically dull katanas. Look there, and stood beside the girl who had hastened to this place, the entire strength of Karnatsy, with the village headman standing first. In other words, the sum of hurled katanas was 50, Tosca. Hurria-o-a-a-a-a-a-a hick. He caught the katana thrown toward him in his right hand and drove in lethal slashes whilst his left hand caught the next one. Turning his body, each time resounded the echo of shattering steel. Tosca gripped a new sword in his hands and abraded the scales of silver. Born there in a trice was a transcendent swordsman who manipulated swords as extensions of his limbs. Fargal, O kinsman of red hair. Eyes dilated, the silver dragon Fargal aimed at Tosca's build whilst its own was being hashed. The golden eyes, until the very end, fumbled for a way to guard the dragon clan Beatrice. Minya! The purple stakes Beatrice fired pierced the dragon's widened golden pupils from the front. Its eyes, unprotected by scales, crystallized, and vision that renunciated its duty lost sight of Tosca. A silver flash severed the dragon's burly throat till the middle, determining the outcome of battle. Looking down onto the hunched silver dragon, Tosca exhaled a white puff, drenched in blood. Towards Tosca came running the young girl who had first rushed here. She leapt onto him, both collapsing within the dragon's blood together. Beatrice. Ah, quite the foolhardiness that girl caused, I suppose. She has him wrapped around her finger, in fact. Puck. Could be. Nonetheless, this means love wins in the end. Whilst viewing Tosca and Remina exchange words within a fountain of blood from afar, Beatrice shrugged as a shrunken Puck came to her. The exhaustion that came with undoing star beastification seemed rather intense, his form now about twice as smaller than usual. Beatrice. That's how adorable Bubby is, I suppose. Betty is madly in love at this point, in fact. Puck. Ahaha, though if I'm this small it's trouble in a lot of ways, so I'm quite the troublemaker. Nevertheless, I guess it's all possible. Beatrice quietly assented to Puck's words as he nodded a couple of times. On the other side of the frolicking couple lay a powerlessly collapsed silver dragon, decapitated. A fearsome dragon who truly possessed Herculean strength. Victory would have been beyond their reach had they lacked even a single person on their side. This included the villagers who mustered their courage and hastened here wielding swords midway through. Fargal, splendid, O children of men. Tosca, hick, stand back, Ramina. It can still talk, huh? Tosca exercised vigilance toward the possibility of the victory they had caught hold of after crossing a brittle tightrope being jolted. However, Fargal appeared to be on the verge of death even from an outsider's perspective, and was not going to persist for long. The silver dragon had been bested in the struggle for survival, and shall fall without exacting revenge on the enemies of its kin. Beatrice. A wrongly aimed revenge at that, I suppose. It's on you to have pulled an unnecessary stunt and lowered the dragon clan's numbers. In fact, Fargal asserts it was splendid. However, Beatrice. However, she thought it would act as a poor loser, however, the dragon shan't do something so low. Then what did it intend the moment she conceived this doubt? Its answer arrived a moment later. Puck, they got us, murmured Puck, looking up to the sky. Lured by his voice, Beatrice raised her countenance as well, and gulped a breath upon witnessing the identical spectacle. It was menace that rivaled the time when Fargal had earlier appeared. No, a spectacle exceeding that. Shouldering the final fragment which the white moon lacked before becoming a full moon, silhouettes drew close whilst flapping their wings. Though their size was not on par with the silver dragon before their eyes, their numbers unveiled despair. Above 10, above 20, above 30, not even 50 but nearly 100 in count, a weigher of silver dragons. This was the raid of the weigher of dragons who sensed crisis upon the future of the dragon clan after the fall of the head of silver dragons of the east. Beatrice and team, who had just brought out and exhausted their all, couldn't possibly ever oppose them. Puck, what do we do, Betty? Beatrice. Only thing possible is for Bubby and Betty to buy time, I suppose. Puck, we might be able to. If in that window Tosca is able to take the villagers, or in the worst-case scenario, just Ramina away, would it count as our task being done? Puck's usual attitude before the weir of dragons close to 100 in count was exceedingly heartening. Following the example of the ever-composed and optimistic stance of her elder brother, Beatrice pressed and ceased her knees from shivering. However, Tosca, please wait. I cannot cause you any more trouble. It was none other than Tosca to impede upon the two's resolve. Making Ramina stand, Tosca, his entire build bedaubed in dragon's blood, shoved her in Beatrice's direction and Tosca. The dragon's aim are big brother's relatives. They will never overlook me. If anything, Beatrice, you're telling us to leave you here and escape with the childhood friend and villagers, I suppose. That's absolutely never going to happen, in fact. Tosca, for what reason? You two have no reason to stake your lives here. For the sake of a village they were unassociated with, she staked her life upon a mere request. Tosca bayed that he could not comprehend this attitude of Beatrice's, his visage verging onto crying. To his question, Beatrice laid a hand on her slim chest and responded. Beatrice, that is Betty's role. To devote her all for Mother, that is Betty's mission. Puck, my mission is a bit different from Betty's, but it's for my cute little sister, asserted Beatrice, and beside her spoke Puck with his unchanging attitude. Hearkening the two's response, Tosca widened his eyes and hung his head down for a bit. However, his vacillation amounted to only a couple of seconds. With an unbroken sword in his hand, he positioned himself and stood beside Beatrice. Beatrice, the opponent is a weigher of 100 dragons, I suppose. Tosca, if it is my sanity that you're questioning, then I have been brain-dead after Big Brother hit me in the head since long before. It would be unhinged if I were to run away, when I was the one to start this. He says quite cool things. Beatrice appended a novel evaluation to Tosca's side profile. And as though emulating this spirit of Tosca's, Ramina and the villagers turned towards the dragons. People who had once backed down and renounced resistance now resolved their determination to oppose their hopeless destiny. The human's unyielding stance made Beatrice strongly, powerfully clench her fist. It felt mortifying that the only one present here was her impotent self. Had the one here instead of Beatrice been her mother, been the witch Echidna then? Had her likely distant mother been kind enough to be here, then stranger? Al Chario, Beatrice. Ah, A feeble note escaped Beatrice's throat upon hearing the abrupt voice from behind. The chant had neither been Beatrice's nor Puck's. It was improbable for it to be Tosca, who knew not even the M in magic, nor the powerless humans of the village. That was the chant of one who was au fait with magic, and was utmost informed about it in this world. As though some dream or illusion, Beatrice turned behind, flustered. The sight reflected within her bluish eyes. The one leisurely ambling toward them was an absolute personage wielding pigment of naught, but the dual contrasts of white and black. The witch, stranger. When I returned to the palace, you two were nowhere to be found beyond having left a parting letter, after all. It just so happened that the dragon of the East was said to have fallen recently, so I was quite worried. Beatrice. Stranger. Your first task seems to have become rather grandiose beyond anticipated. No scope for negligence or interlude. Called by Beatrice's quivering voice, the lady, garbed in black and hair stretching long and white, leisurely halted her gait. Hearing her call, Tosca froze, his eyes dilated. He had knowledge of only one person whom Beatrice referred to as mother. Tosca. Could it be, you are the witch of wisdom, Sama? Beatrice. Yes, in fact. Your head is up, I suppose, human. Prostrate yourself right this instant, stranger. Beatrice. Eek! Deeming Tosca's bearing as irreverent, Beatrice alerted him whilst correcting her own posture. Her mother's hand placed atop her slender shoulder, Beatrice bewailed upon her touch. However, mother, the witch Echidna faintly loosened her lips. Echidna. You persevered well during my absence. However, I cannot close my eyes to that tone. Beatrice, that was, to educate this man, on what courtesy is. Puck. Well, it's all right, Echidna. You also know Betty's a hard worker and has no ill will, yeah. It was Puck who advocated for the humbled Beatrice, seated on her shoulder other than the one Echidna set her hand onto. A carefree exchange, failing to read the air Tosca insisted with a Peeply's weight, his voice brimming with fluster. Tosca. It is a great honor that you came all the way here, witch Sama. But the weyer of dragons is still. Beatrice. What are you acting so frightened for, in fact, disgraceful? Beatrice glared at Tosca as she snuggled with Puck, his form now the original, adorable one, by her cheek. However, he seemed to not comprehend whatsoever, hastily darting his eyes about. Looking at Beatrice, Puck, and subsequently Echidna, Tosca then gulped his saliva and Tosca. Witch Sama, what does? Echidna. It's not anything particularly convoluted. The events transpiring are simple, said Echidna with one eye closed, facing about toward the imminent weyer of dragons. Lured into her movement, Tosca identically viewed the sky and took notice. Beatrice and Puck also gazed at the dragons perfusing the sky and pitied them. Discerning Tosca's brother as a hazard, and the stance to resist their downfall was unerring, yet, Beatrice, it is your greatest misfortune that you went against mother, I suppose. In Beatrice's field of vision, as she whispered so, the dragons that perfused the sky finally detected the menace. However, they wouldn't make it in time by the time they detected it. Echidna's chant, Al-Chario, set forth its efficacy and destruction manifested in the world. Al-Chario, the force it brought forth, was Fargal. Inconceivable. The dying Fargal distended its eyes upon the preposterous scene. Hearing the voice of that silver dragon, Echidna raked her fingers through her white hair. Echidna. Should there be any dragons that survive through those falling stars, I shall listen once again. The sky which dragons reigned, from which far, far higher above, descending from beyond, was an onslaught of stardust. Assailing upon the weyer of dragons with velocity, and might that rendered any defense or evasion impossible, within the destruction kindled by stars they were scorched. Scorched. This was the true end, true ruin brought forth by the absolute personage, the witch. Echidna. Going forward, I shall put Karnatsi under my supervision. If anyone has any objections, let us have a thorough debate. Should that not suffice, you are free to exercise force. Who on earth could defy this ordinance coming from a witch who had dropped stars? The weyer of dragons who had advanced towards Karnatsi, intending to bring ruin to Tosca's kin. Much of the dragons, close to 100 in totality, had fallen, with only 4 remaining. one of them being Fargal, injuries healed by Echidna's hand, thus managing to hold on to its life on the brink of perishing. It was the young leader of the Weir of Silver Dragons. The dragons who attempted to fight in order to escape downfall exhibited no purpose of resistance before definite ruin, and hanged the heads of their gargantuan bodies low and pledged an oath to Echidna's words. Fargal, we comply. Dragons born from the eastern sky shalt not lay a finger upon the redhead's kin again. Echidna, eastern sky, huh? I do feel your attitude in surrendering is somewhat unfavorable, but that cannot be helped. On my behalf, I understand. Young man, what shall you do? Tosca. Me? Asked by Echidna to whom the dragon submitted, Tosca was at a loss for answer. Making the dragon surrender was Echidna's feat, but the one to defeat the mightiest dragon had unequivocally been him. It seemed that had not fully hit him yet, but Beatrice. Don't be so stumped, stand upright, in fact. Saving the childhood friend and the village was not your elder brother's but your own deed, I suppose. Your elder brother was instead the main reason behind this impending ruin, in fact. Tosca. Beatrice Jan. Beatrice. Why are you saying Chan again, I suppose? Beatrice violently stepped on Tosca's foot, feeling she was being made light of. Tosca howled, that hurt. Upon the affliction, smiling wryly with tears in his eyes. He subsequently took a deep inhale, slapping his cheeks with his own 2 hands. Tosca, Echidna-sama, I hold no objections either. All I did was try saving my childhood friend, Remina. I do not wish for the dragons to be felled. Echidna, so he says. Rather too kind-hearted for the side who was made to confront imminent ruin without any dialogue or discussion, wouldn't you say? Hearing Tosca's reply, Echidna gazed at the dragons, a single eye closed. The survivor dragons, upon receiving that witch's gaze, bowed to Tosca, his expression now altered. I thank thee. The dragon's brief words marked an intermission to the havoc enkindled by dragons that had assailed upon Karnatsi. And now then, let us commence the wedding between the village's hero, Tosca, and the one selected by him, Remina. Hurrah! With the village headman's exuberant greeting, the villagers cheered, each holding a cup of wine. And in the core of the whirlpool of thus arising unbridled enthusiasm stood the dressed-up duo of Tosca and the young girl. First and foremost, all dressed up meant was Tosca had changed into rough clothes of etiquette, his head now crowned with a festival ornament made out of animal bones. The one truly dolled up was the lovely, sweet young girl beside him, her cheeks slightly tinged. Remina. Remina, now garbed in a wedding dress, was originally supposed to have lost her life as sacrifice to the dragon by now. For her fate had been changed, there was no way she had not found happiness. Beatrice. How rich, in fact, won't go along with humans' merrymaking, I suppose. Puck, really? I'm really fond of auspicious atmospheres and seeing people get drunk and be stupid, though. Beatrice. Bubby's generous outlook is yet far too undoable for Betty, in fact. Passing on a slice of meat to Puck atop her shoulder, Beatrice sighed. The oath pledged between Tosca and the dragons became an ever-inviolable covenant, with Echidna being its overseer. Thus, Tosca had truly become a hero. And heroes were rewarded, and the reward he asked for was the young girl beloved to him. As a result, a celebratory banquet was held and Tosca's dearest wish had come true. Beatrice. The girl was not against it either, I suppose. It was just his overthinking. Viewing everybody's bustling back and forth, Beatrice, however, did not feel appeased. Tosca having Remina as his bride was a respectable reward. However, the villagers attempted to sacrifice Remina without any attempt for resistance against the dragon, did they not? Echidna. A rather joyless expression you have there, Beatrice. Beatrice. Mother. Beside the sullen-faced Beatrice, Echidna gently lowered her hips. Through the course of the feast, there had been an endless number of villagers coming to greet Echidna, who had saved the village in essence. Apprised of words of reverence and gratitude from the villagers, her interactions had now finally arrived at a pause. Beatrice bit her lips upon Echidna's glance, feeling her innermost heart had been peeked into. However, her mother did not press her further. In the end, unable to withstand the silence, Beatrice spoke up. Beatrice. Betty, Thinks nobody except Tosca has the right to be joyful like this, I suppose. Echidna. Their village was saved, and they did not have to lose their family or neighbors. You proclaim they don't have the right to celebrate that felicity. Beatrice. Yes, in fact. After all, the one to persevere in the beginning was only Tosca, I suppose. Nobody lent an ear to Tosca's words. Tosca had no allies, in fact. Even Tosca must not have chosen the which olive a sudden among the options he had at first. He must have scrambled for a way to confront the dragon in his own way, consulted the villagers, and even considered taking the childhood friend away from the village. The reason why he nonetheless did not abandon the village was because he was a virtuous human and a coward who could not sacrifice many. If that coward had brought forth the miracle of protecting what he cherished to the end, then Beatrice. Miracles ought to be a reward bestowed upon those who persevered, I suppose. It was to Beatrice's whispers, her expression one of vexation, that Echidna faintly widened her eyes. Echidna's rare surprise eluded notice by Beatrice, who glared down to her own hands. Instead murmured Puck, "Reward for perseverance," whilst atop her slender shoulder. "Puck, you sure are kind, Betty. That's why you don't like people who persevered and people who didn't being treated the same way." Beatrice. "It might just be pettiness, in fact." Puck. "Nah, that's not true. Besides, Betty's words just now made me feel I've recalled what I need to do too." Beatrice. "Bubby?" Softly levitating from her shoulder, Puck stretched its tiny billed midair. Caught into his remark, Beatrice raised her eyes up to the tiny cat, her shoulders slumped. Upon Beatrice's gaze, Puck laughed whilst caressing his face with a hand. Puck. "Miracles are rewards for those who worked hard, then I've gotta work hard too. My stopover has gone on for a bit too long." Beatrice. "Ha ha ha, Echidna. Are you leaving, Puck?" Puck and Echidna's dialogue proceeded, deserting the bewildered Beatrice behind. Echidna inquired, her eyes straightened, to which Puck nodded with a hum. Puck. "I have a mission I was born with. Though that doesn't go for me alone, mine's a bit more precise and weighty than others. I'm leaving in order to fulfill that." Echidna. "I see, I shall not impede. However, you mustn't act contrary to the contract." Puck. "Ha ha ha, that again? Seriously, that's all you guys are all about." Laughing like a human, Puck then proceeded to descend before Beatrice. Puck gently brushed the bewildered Beatrice's nose with his tail. The sensation swaying her eyelashes, Beatrice vocalized Bubby and called her brother. Beatrice. "Bubby, you're going to go away, I suppose." Puck. Sorry, Betty. I'll be parting ways for a bit, but it's not for always. Once I find what I'm searching for, I'll come back. Even if I don't, I'll look through till every edge of the world, then come back." Beatrice. Ah, indifferently informed, the feeling of wanting to stop him clogged up to her throat. However, Beatrice was identical to Puck, an artificial spirit. She could empathize to a painful extent with Puck, who wished to fulfill the mission he was born with. Therefore, she could not stop him. Born before her, her elder brother in its truest sense. The only two artificial spirits in this world. Beatrice. "Take care of yourself, don't catch a cold, in fact." Puck. "You're right, I'll be careful I don't throw my blanket off while sleeping. You too, Betty. Get along and don't quarrel with Mother, okay?" Waving his tiny hand, Puck elevated himself from Beatrice's frontage up toward the night sky. At the same pace, his form as he swayed his lengthy tail proceeded to diminish. Before long, he was engulfed within the night sky and disappeared. In the night embellished with stars, Puck's form was no longer there to be seen. Although for an instant she anticipated this to be a joke and he would come back down to her, but Echidna. "So he's gone, huh?" It was known that this would happen, but how truly unemotional. Must be to a significant extent, if I'm the one saying this. Her mother's words, by her side, repudiated all possibility for this to be a joke. Ever since she had been born, she had spent greater than half of all these months and years alongside her elder brother. Beatrice's heart was scourged with loneliness, desolateness that Puck was gone. Tosca. "Huh, Beatrice Jan, where is Puck-sama? Took up any more tasks?" Abruptly came today's lead actor Tosca towards Beatrice, whose eyes were cast down in lonesomeness. He restlessly surveyed the environs and touched on Puck's absence with a sense of dissonance. However, Beatrice firmly shook her head. "Beatrice." Bubby is gone, I suppose. For his mission, he embarked on a journey. Tosca. Embarked on a journey, you say, in the midst of this banquet. There's no way something so bizarre. Tosca, is that true? His cheeks tinted in red, likely due to wine. Tosca froze and distended his eyes. Beatrice did not refute his doubt. Shoulders ducked inward, she nodded. Beatrice. True, I suppose. Well, it cannot be helped, in fact. Bubby has something he must do and was just on a stopover during his journey, I suppose. So, Tosca. Beatrice Jan, are you fine this way? Beatrice. W, what do you mean fine? Of course Betty is fine, in fact. It's Bubby's duty, I suppose. Tosca. But your expression really says you're about to cry. With this pointed out to her, Beatrice touched her cheek. Fortunately, no tears had flowed, but this gesture alone made for sufficient basis to legitimize Tosca's words. Tosca. Echidna-sama, did you not stop him? Echidna, he couldn't have been stopped, you see. Just as this child said, he departed on a journey in order to fulfill his duty. This was a stopover in his journey. The journey's adjournment and resumption are all by his volition. Tosca. But Beatrice Jan looked so very lonesome. Because she had been with Puck-sama, she had only barely managed to hang on, so... Tosca clung to Echidna, delineating as though having surmised Beatrice's innermost heart and feelings. To this subject Beatrice reddened her cheeks and stood up. Beatrice, don't go on saying things per your own convenience, in fact. Betty is all right, I suppose. Even if Bubby isn't there, Betty is going strong, in fact. Tosca. Beatrice Jan. Beatrice, Bubby left to fulfill his mission, to work hard and persevere, I suppose. He decided to work hard in order to invoke a miracle, in fact. That cannot be obstructed, I suppose. She shall admit it felt lonely. No lies in that. But someone else's heart could not be judged to be chained, using one's own lonesomeness as pretext. Tosca failed to vocalize anything before Beatrice as she averred so, and just looked on at her with eyes abound in compassion. Beatrice attempted to snarl at his gaze right away, Echidna. Beatrice, is it true that you feel lonely? Beatrice. That's Alri. Echidna. Beatrice. The strength she wished to bluff was whittled with only a call of her name. Beatrice. It feels lonely, in fact. Mother leaves often, I suppose. It would be trouble should something like today happen again, so Betty knows she must guard your absence, in fact. But Echidna, I see I neglected that on my part. You would feel all the more lonely with Puck gone, if that is the case, then perhaps the timing is quite right. Beatrice. Right timing, Mother, whatever may that mean, I suppose. Echidna. The other day I found a child suffering from mana periods. Though a human nobility, I wish for him to learn magic. Thereupon, I intended to have him take lessons in the palace until he's made progress. Beatrice was petrified by her mother's dissonant, and yet again, unconsulted words. Quite the explosive proposal, when she reckoned days of lonesomeness, would befall with Puck's egress. Mana periods were akin to periods wherein mana that could not be released damaged the body from within. It was a condition that generally occurred only in demi-humans or spirits that utilized massive quantities of mana, but the same could rarely occur with humans blessed with potent talent. Tosca. Thank God. That means Beatrice Jan won't be alone, isn't it? Beatrice. Why would you feel relieved, in fact? It has nothing to do with you, I suppose. Tosca. No, I mean, Puck-sama left for his journey with the impetus of my request, and if Beatrice Jan were to become lonely because of that, I wouldn't know how to hold responsibility for it. Beatrice, nobody asked you to hold any responsibility, in fact. Whether it be about the elder brother or the dragon, Beatrice was utterly flabbergasted by soft-hearted Tosca's attitude. Though it may be precisely because of this tactless honesty of his that he even resolved to fight the dragon with the sole will to protect his childhood friend, Beatrice. Keep this up, and you'll suffer one day, I suppose. Hereafter you've got someone to protect, so take proper care of yourself and don't act rashly. In fact, Betty is, well, she's all right, I suppose. Tosca. Beatrice Jan, Beatrice. As much as you can, celebrate your short human life and become happy. In fact, Mother's benevolence and protection will magnanimously shelter and shield you all going forward as well, I suppose. Tosca widened his eyes upon Beatrice's words, then subsequently placed himself into a deep kneel. The respectful bow, a gesture of gratitude, was directed not toward Echidna but Beatrice. Beatrice. You, that respect belongs to mother, in fact. Tosca. Of course, I am also grateful to Echidna-sama. But you were so kind as to listen to my request in the beginning, and lent not just your wisdom but even your strength. I wish to show gratitude to you. Beatrice. Tosca. It is you who is my savior, Beatrice Jan. One day, for certain, I shall repay this debt. In face of Tosca's terribly humble statement, befitting of identifying as a pledge, Beatrice turned to her mother, to Echidna in search of an answer. However, Echidna did not unveil an answer in her intellectual black eyes. She solely jerked her chin, telling her to face Tosca. Beatrice deliberated much. It would detriment her image both as the witch Echidna's daughter and as a great spirit to provide an offhand answer here. Therefore, Beatrice focused her gaze directly into Tosca's blue pupils. Beatrice. Your vow was certainly heard, I suppose. It shall be placed in some corner of Betty's mind with no expectations set upon it, in fact. You too can brace yourself just to that meager degree, I suppose. Tosca. Understood, but I will repay the debt I've incurred on this day back to you, for certain. Beatrice. You aren't even trying to get it at all, in fact. This is why humans invite trouble, I suppose. So she accepted the youth's vow, his hair an incandescent red, without ever allowing herself to be honest with herself. Several days had passed since the dragon catastrophe of Karnatsi and the sudden parting with Puck. That day, the palace of the Witch of Wisdom, Echidna, for the first time welcomed a human not possessing a wish to be carried to the witch. Halting the vehicle pulled by grim oxen, Pharaoh, a vast amount of baggage by his feet, was a seemingly ill-healthy skinny youth, his hair stretching long in navy blue, concealing the nervousness of meeting someone for the first time behind a composed visage. Beatrice ascertained the features of the youth who looked toward her that she had been informed of. Long slitted blue eyes, an orderly countenance. The initial impression of him being ill-healthy did not diminish, but the youth had an expression devoid of anxiety and fear in a world wherein existed extraordinary principles which he set foot upon for the first time. Such was his visage, and upon noticing Beatrice standing there to receive him in the entry hall, the youth respectfully bowed. The carefully conscious etiquette up until his very fingertips was proof of him having received the finest tutelage. The youth aimed his blue eyes directly towards Beatrice, who perceived this, and stranger. Today onwards, I shall be under the care of teacher Echidna-sama. My name is Altair Mathers. Pleased to make your acquaintance. Naming himself so, he presented a smile with an expression of cheerfulness that looked up towards the hopes of future. Beatrice. And so, thus concludes the bittersweet story of Betty and Bubby. A hand before her chest, Beatrice marked the cessation to a long, long reminiscence. From the very beginning till the very end, Luz had been experiencing the joys and sorrows of the story. She put a hand on her mouth and timidly glanced toward the side, seeking an answer to the final twist. Luz. Altair-sama would be, Roswal. It refers to me. In our house, generation after generation, the head of the household succeeds the name Roswal. Before I expelled my parents and siblings, my name had been Altair. Luz. I see Altair-sama. Dissonantly divulging his name change, Roswal made a nostalgic expression. These events must have occurred multiple years ago, as Beatrice then grimaced. Beatrice. Infuriatingly enough, he changed his name right after coming to the palace, I suppose. Back then, Betty started doubting what kind of a prank it was, in fact. Roswal. Calling it a prank would be quite the exaggeration. Since back then, I had been yearning to be useful to teacher as soon as possible, you see. That's why it was necessary for me to be in a position where I could freely utilize my house's authority. The name succession came as a result of that. As one who loved her own, Beatrice could not possibly comprehend being dispassionate regarding one's own name. Above all, that too was significantly because the one to give her this name had been her godparent, her mother, and she believed the same could be said about Roswal. What granted foundation to something's worth was also significantly because of who it was that had given it. Just as Beatrice cherished the name given to her by Echidna, Roswal too surely cherished anything given to him by Echidna without letting go. Luz. But, listening to this story, I have grown very much fond of Puck-sama. I would love to meet him once as well. Beatrice. HM, that's a matter of course, I suppose. Bubby's cuteness and furriness can't be expressed in words, in fact. Should you actually see him, it'll be life-changing, I suppose. Luz. Tea that much so, gulp. Gulping saliva, Luz nervously imagined the arrival of that time. Watching her spirits, Beatrice pondered she might have uttered something a bit too aggrandized. The girl, who had been visited by a multitude of misfortunes until reaching sanctuary due to her bloodline, could not leave this land for now, because they were in the midst of constructing and acclimatizing a technique connected with the soil and the inhabitants' blood. Luz. You do not need to worry yourself, Beatrice Sama. Beatrice. MGH, however, her heart was read by none other than Luz. The girl slowly shook her head, touching her ear slightly lengthier than usual people's. Luz. There is much that I do not know or have not seen. So, it makes me happy to be told of so many things by Beatrice Sama like this. Beatrice? Well, then it's fine, in fact. Betty wasn't bothered by that at all, I suppose. Feeling uneasy, Beatrice averted her gaze. Luz let out a small laugh seeing Beatrice, with the latter miraculously not being displeased by it. Roswell, at any rate, teacher was magnificent in your story earlier. Who would have thought she would drop stars and repel the wayer of dragons? It means even the skies abide by teacher's word. Beatrice. Quite the good phrasing, in fact, Roswell. No choice but to compliment you for that one, I suppose. Roswell. In terms of words that extol teacher, there's no thing that stands equal with me after all. Beatrice word to Roswell's phraseology, to which he bowed in a dramatic gesture. Luz watched over the two's exchange with a pleasant smile when Echidna. My goodness. I was wondering what it was that you all were talking about. Beatrice. Mother. Roswell. Teacher. At the spot where arrangements for supper were being made, Echidna joined them after finishing her business. The Bell Witch, with characteristic black outfit and white hair, closed an eye to the gazes of her beloved daughter and her beloved pupil, Echidna. Talking about Puck is rather rare. That child doesn't show himself oft either. I do not believe he perished, but how truly cold-hearted. Beatrice. Bubby must have also entered an age where a lot of stuff becomes problematic, in fact. Betty wouldn't worry about it, I suppose. Putting that aside, it's time for dinner, in fact. Mother, please have a seat beside Betty, I suppose. Roswell. No, teacher, beside me. I had some doubts I wish to ask you regarding Earth IV just about now as well. Beatrice. That's just an excuse, in fact. To begin with, Mother abandoned writing Earth IV midway through, so even reading it would amount to just feeling unsure, I suppose. She snarled at Roswell, who took out the book and attempted to draw Echidna's interest with that as pretext. Receiving her words, Roswell shrugged with a my. Roswell, you certainly wouldn't pull such a shambolic stunt when it comes to teacher, at least, yes. If you think it has ended midway through, then doesn't that mean you simply lack the knowledge to imagine what content would be written afterwards? Beatrice. Galling, in fact, quite audacious of you to say this before Betty, I suppose. Roswell. Whoa, you want to go at it? Beatrice. Exactly what Betty wishes, in fact. Leaping over the book's content, they then jumped to guessing the author, Echidna's intents. The two's quarrel subsequently overheated, and the two finally came down to utilizing force. Away from the bonfire, the two ardently headed toward open ground. Beatrice and Roswell's tussle. It was wholly Beatrice who got heated up, but it was a usual affair for it to aggravate and outburst into a contention of magic. Luz. Echidna-sama, what should we do? The hot pot will get cold. Echidna. You seem to be more accommodating than what I anticipated as well. I am relieved. I shall keep an eye on those two. Raising her hips, which she had just seated, Echidna proceeded to watch over the dispute between the toilsome two. When Echidna vocalized, "That's right," and halted her steps. Echidna, you are having to persist remaining here, but I hope you aren't facing any inconveniences. Beatrice has become quite attached to you as well. Should there be anything you need, I would like to be as open to it as possible. But, Luz, be by no means. Besides, I enjoy being with Beatrice-sama as well. Echidna, I see. Luz, please get along with her. Upon a rare request coming from Echidna, Luz couldn't help but be petrified, eyebrows raised. Consequently, Echidna's figure proceeded to distance away without hearing any answer. Luz, yes, if I suffice, kindly allow me to get along with her. Before her figure subsequently dwindled, Luz cried, erasing her thoughts. Echidna did not halt her gait upon hearing it. She simply waved her hand, slightly. With the alias witch came all kinds of hazardous histories and rumors. But by Luz's word, who was acquainted with the genuine witch, a majority of those baseless rumors were false and groundless. There existed only one thing which she could not refute, that too something superficial. A gauche and kind lady, simply wielding might that transcended human intellect. Luz. Both Beatrice Sama and Roswal Sama love the same person, and yet, although Roswal Sama pokes a bit too much fun at Beatrice Sama. Even to an outsider's eye, it was clear as day that Roswal doted on Beatrice. The reason why this was not conveyed to the pivotal Beatrice was because his way of expressing his love was exceedingly childish. Roswal. Well, what's the matter, Beatrice? Messing about even when teacher is watching. Beatrice, that's it, you've really infuriated Betty now, I suppose. Won't forgive you no matter what, no matter absolutely what in fact. She could hear the distant voices of the cordial two, frolicking. Luz's lips unwittingly gave way to a smile, and reckoned Echidna must have conceived an identical emotion. The queer relationships of the sanctuary, relationships that definitely did not comprise family, nor were they not a relationship of benefit. Though not Roswal, she wished for bonds not inferior to the elder brother Beatrice had affectionately spoken of to henceforward be nurtured here and tied together. Whilst musing so, Luz scooped a bite out of the hot pot with a spoon and tasted the supper. Luz, delicious as always. She was excited to see once the contention of magic came to a halt and the three returned, how they shall all react. Roswal, who queerly preferred simple flavors, or Echidna, who did not feel quenched until she had analyzed everything about the particulars of the ingredients used, or Beatrice, who exceeded her bounds and attempted to finish everything served. Experiencing a multitude of meetings and partings, Beatrice shall certainly prevail alongside the witch. Luz lovingly surmised about the gallant girl. That happiness lay ahead of that road. She prayed, wishing for there to be fortune, felicity upon that road.